And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. You know, guys, it's interesting. Another report came out on sort of what I consider the devastating effects of modernity and sort of that generation, the millennial generation, and really every generation since really, the baby boom generation, where the belief in God is continuing to kind of actually collapse at this point in history. We got a Breitbart story here. Says survey 43% of millennials don't know, care, or believe God exists. And I'll just read just the first two paragraphs here, really short, guys. The America Worldview Inventory 2021, an annual survey that examines the perspective of adults age 18 and over in the United States, found that while 57% of millennials born between 84 and 2002 consider themselves to be Christian, 43% don't know, care, or believe that God exists. Comparatively, 70% of Gen Xers, which were born between 65 and 83, 79% of baby boomers born between 46 and 64, and 83% of the builder generation between 27 and 45 consider themselves to be Christian, while 31, 28, and 27 respectively don't know, don't care, or believe that God exists. This is the bottom line. It's been a declining trend here in America, and I would argue worldwide, since really the 1960s when it began to collapse. I think you go back a little bit earlier, don't get me wrong, especially in America. You could probably go back to the 1920s, where we begin to see that. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think starting with the Industrial Revolution and mass immigration, late 1800s to the early 1900s, I think you begin to see a more pluralistic, diverse population, and an attempt for sort of these diversified cultures, where they were Italians or Irish or Germans or Polish. Something has to be given up in order to accommodate sort of pluralistic values, right? And I think we begin to see this really almost right away as immigrants start to come over. I think when we look at these numbers of current generation, it's like I continue to say, I think this highlights again that we are in the midst of the great apostasy. That great apostasy that Our Lady warned us about in very many apparitions, whether it's La Salette or Lourdes or Fatima or I don't know, I'm not sure about Lourdes, but I know in La Salette and Fatima and Quito, she warned us about this grand apostasy that was to come, not only on the culture itself, but also the church as well too. And so that's where we get into a lot of these arguments and discussion, kind of like the chicken or the egg. What comes first? Is it the apostasy or the problems within the church, or is it within the culture that it all affects one another? I think when we look at this situation again, and these numbers are absolutely collapsing at this point in history, and God only knows what a civilization where a majority of people have not only lost their faith in God and don't believe in God, but I believe these things come full circle, and eventually, and I think we're seeing this already, we're going to go back to paganism at some point, right? Because listen, a vacuum fills a void, kind of a thing, right? That's the old saying, right? Because I think as people we were born and raised and sort of brought up to believe in something. We were created to believe in something greater than ourselves. I think oftentimes when we look at the right and the left dichotomy in America, it's a situation where many people have invested themselves in sort of rational theory, of course, right? And I think in that, I've seen a lot of it on the classical liberal right, for example, where they'll say they believe in God, but it's this abstract kind of a deist God, right? Where the left is kind of more, I think, more openly honest about the rejection of God and all the laws of God. And in many respects, you see lots of what I would consider demonic behavior from many members on the left side of sort of the political aisle. And I think this is the problem that going forward is that religion, faith, especially stemming from the old world in the realm of orthodoxy, was the glue that held sort of civilization together. And I don't think it's a coincidence that really since the Enlightenment, we've seen this unraveling of faith, and not only have individuals fallen down this path, but states and nations have fallen down this path. And this is why we've seen the rise of godlessness over the past 250 years since the Enlightenment. I think France is a great example of that. And I don't think America's far behind. I just think France got a head start because it was the home of ultimately the Enlightenment, and then it kind of expanded out into America. And like I said to you so many times before, I think America in a day and age where, we didn't have the mass transit communications and travel in that sense. I think America was protected by those oceans a little bit more. It was kind of like a desolate land where people were trying to figure out what's going on. It was kind of that brave new world. But again, in a continent like Europe, where it's been there for thousands of years, the faith had to truly be eradicated. I've talked about that a lot before, and I think that's why the French Revolution goes more extreme. But really, it is France that I can't say France starts it. I mean, the original Masonic revolutions began, of course, in America, and then America. Well, it's a strange situation because you got a Catholic monarch there that actually assists in the American Revolution, obviously, but then the revolutionaries in America give their full support, of course, to the revolutionaries in France, and that's an interesting kind of situation there historically. But I think what we're seeing clearly is an apostasy that is further building on top of one another, right? Because religion is something that's handed down from one generation to the next. And when you have generation before that has apostatized, it's only natural that apostasy would increase in proportion in future generations. And this is exactly what we've seen. So we probably see the apostasy, probably, honestly, I mean, we can go back again to the Enlightenment, but honestly in America, because again, America begins that industrialization period and is more kind of a desolate land for this first, let's call it up until the 1880s roughly, right? Maybe 1860s, you want to call it that. You begin to see this kind of progressive nature of America start to advance in late 1880s up to the 1920s. I think that's where it starts, and that's why these numbers are important. If you listen to how I laid them out, it's one generation sort of, or the next generation apostatizes even more so than the previous generation. When families are passing the faith on to each other, and that's important, right? Because, through our fallen nature, we need the faith, the one true faith, in order to control sort of these passions, these innate passions that seem to dominate us and really become out of whack as true faith and religion die down. And this is why we've seen a sort of a culture that's completely morally decadent at this point, right? Faith has broken down, and with that has come really the moral decadence of civilization, whether it's the disorder of sexuality, disorder of materialism, the disorder of apathy, and even sloth and gluttony. For that respect, we have it all now because there is no ability for us. Again, through our fallen nature, there is no mechanism to help us control sort of those passions or those sins that consume us in civilization. The church with the sacraments used to be that sort of that main feature, right? America in itself never being inherently Catholic, gravitating toward Protestantism and its anarchistic doctrines, never really had a method for dealing with man's fallen nature. This is why we get kind of things like religious liberty, right? And these abstract ideas of freedom, you do you, I do me. And as long as we don't cross each other's property lines, we don't kill each other. And that was it got kind of worked for a while, because again, you still had sort of the fumes of the old Catholic world that were embraced through family lineage, right? But as the past begins to be watered down and the propaganda takes its toll, and how horrible the old world was, which a lot of it was nothing but lies, but we begin to see this apostasy creep in one generation after the next, and here we are, a completely apostatized nation. And really, again, we look at it from the progressive perspective, the far left wing cheering us on, again, demonic influences. But my concern, as usual, is really concerned with the right, who still, to a certain degree, understand right from wrong, okay? Because, some say that they still believe in religion, again, very abstract for the most part. Their problem, of course, is they don't know how to deal with this, right? Because everything, it comes down to rationalism for them, right? We use logic, we use reason, and through the, as I've talked about so many times before, through the, the sort of the competitive nature and the economic engine of prosperity, we can affect people through utilitarian economic principles. And this is what the right has done. And this is why I've always said, when I was in right-wing camp for so many years, it was a surrender to cultural issues, right? Because I think in their own way, they've seen the collapsing culture coming down the pipe since at least the 1960s. We've all seen it. I mean, my entire life, I've watched the culture degenerate one year after another. But for the right, who doesn't want to get mired in social issues, and because their adherence to democracy always forces them to have to accommodate certain sins in the sense that we got an election to win, we've seen the right wingers really water down moral issues and ultimately surrender. And that's why toward the end of, when I was in that right wing camp, they was telling me, Frank, get over it. We lost on the social issues. Let's just focus on economics. Very libertarian-esque, I guess you could say in that sense. But of course, it's like I said, if you have disorder in the social realm, disorder in sort of at the family level, disorder at the cultural level, it's eventually going to lead to disorder at the economic level, right? And we're seeing the disorder at the economic level now. At this point in history, as we got a government that continues to spend more and more money, becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, takes more and more power, right? And so, and again, this always comes down to, again, the right saying, okay, well, yeah, things are going to hell in a handbasket, but we can manage the decline better than our leftist siblings. And this all stems from the lack of morality, again, which nobody wants to deal with at this point in time because we're all trying to manage the collapse, right? I mean, you take a guy like, who was it? Rick Santorum, that ran a few years back, right? And the whole contraception issue. They actually threw the contraception issue at Mitt Romney in that election. Was it 08, I believe is when it was, or 2012? Year Barack Obama won, right? And but Santorum, wasn't a perfect senator, I will say that, but he did stand up for the issue of contraception, which we Catholics, of course, are concerned with. And whenever that came up, it's always been a big issue because contraception, again, through the eyes of Protestantism that caved in on the whole, again, contraception thing, back in the 1920s, 1930s, it's not an issue in America. It's an issue of freedom. It's an issue of liberty to control reproductive system rather than putting your faith in God. And again, valuing large families. Now, I think the conservatives would say, in large respect, is our economy has changed. Big families, you don't need big families to work on the family farms anymore. Well, fine. But as a moral principle, Western civilization understood that suppressing the nature of sexuality within a marriage was problematic and sinful, right? And so while you can make an economic argument, again, a utilitarian argument, to tell us why contraception is somehow inherently valuable in a more modern economy, I'm going to tell you right now that once you begin to go down the path of telling people, well, you can control your sexuality this way, and this way, it's only going to lead to other natural consequences. It's going to unleash, again, that sexual nature of humanity, right? This is why, listen, the pill is made over the counter, 1961, I believe. It wasn't long after that that abortion was made legal, pornography was made legal, divorce and remarriage was made legal. Why? Because you untamed the sexual passions of man. And ironically enough, that's where the apostasy begins. What's the old saying here is that, all sins begin under the belt. Well, we see that in the 1960s. And once they begin under the belt and we see a progression of natural means of reproduction, sort of people become more liberally sort of forward with that, I guess you can say. It's only a matter of time till this really affects how the family structure would come to be in future generations, right? Because we're talking about reproductive issues here, right? What the family looks like in the future, right? And so sexuality becomes more of an adult exercise that's one seeking pleasure. Well, it's always an adult exercise, don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is once you remove sort of that inherent, the reproductive nature from the act of sexuality, now you've made it simply about pleasure, right? And once it becomes about pleasure, then it becomes about controlling how your family is structured. And most people have said, well, listen, I don't need 10 kids anymore because the economy or some utilitarian principle, right? I need to control and restrict, again, what I'm doing with my body because of economic principles. Well, all right, fine. I mean, you can do that, but look what's happened ever since. We are now not even replacing ourselves with fertility rates anymore, again, because we're all controlling this mechanism, this natural fertility rate that's collapsing all over the West. Ironically, starting in 1961, if you look at the fertility rates across the globe, 1961 is the key. It's where you begin to see, again, the numbers skyrocket down in the West. Now they skyrocket down all over the world because contraception has been spread all over the world, but because it begins in the West and we take a more forward liberal attitude to these things, it's really nosedive off the cliff. And with that has come, of course, abortion and divorce and remarriage and the utter destruction of the family. That's the whole point of this, right? So if you have parents that are not willing to consider God's laws on how family is structured, how do we expect kids to react? You're breaking 2,000 years of sacred tradition. Some would argue even longer than that, but you're breaking the bond of sacred tradition that is passed down from one generation to the next. And this one generation, let's argue in the 1960s, said enough is enough. I got my liberty. I got my freedom. I'm going to choose to control my reproductive nature. That changed the entire trajectory of human civilization and how we look at reproduction rights. And because parents broke away with the traditions of the faith, what makes you think that future generations are not going to further apostatize? And that's exactly what we've seen, right? We've seen the complete apostasy of future generations starting in the 1960s. But, we don't want to make these connections. It's too hard because when you talk about sins below the belt, it's something we all like, right? It's something that we'll all become convenient. It's part of the materialism and part of the pleasure civilization that we've become. But with that has come consequences, right? Broken families, illegitimacy, single parenthood, all these things that disproportionately affect not only individual families, but society as a whole. This is why we continue to hear the statistics of sort of the dysfunction of children that come from single family homes, right? With higher crime rates and higher poverty rates and higher all this stuff that's negatively adverses or negatively affects families and individuals. And then we wonder why, when we get to the polls, why so many people continue to vote for the far left progressive candidates, right? I got classical liberals telling me that, well, we've all gone mad. We've all gone mad. There's something wrong here. It's leadership issues in the country. We got poor leadership. And my thing is, leadership is just the byproduct of the culture that we have. And culture is the byproduct of the families that we've raised. We've destroyed the family. The culture is rotten to the core. And what do you expect? Virtuous politicians to rise, especially in a political system where ambition is one of the great virtues, right? Because in a society that has no moral arbiter of truth, in a society that has kicked out Holy Mother Church as a moral arbiter of truth, where we said, here's your own personal moral codes, religious liberty, religious freedom, pick and choose whatever moral code you want. Well, that also means that if people don't want to follow traditional morality and really indulge in vice, guess what? They're allowed to do that. And many of these politicians, very ambitious, they're the go-getters, right? They're the go-getters. They've indulged in vice. And when you got a right wing in America that doesn't differentiate between success without sort of certain moral stipulations, right? That even increases the problem. This is why when right wingers say to me, you gotta go out there and pull yourself up by your bootstrap, go out there and make $1 trillion, but there's no moral dictates, right? We've had certain talk show hosts that have rise to power on the right side that have labeled themselves or made themselves out to be, again, those rags to riches, great American stories of pulling yourselves up by your bootstrap, broke 15 times and bankrupt another 10 times. And yet, when you look at the life of this individual, they were divorced 3 or 4 times. They broke up 3 or 4 families. Some of them never even have children. themselves. So never having to face the same obstacles as everyday Americans that might partake of some more traditional virtues. My point is, even the right wingers, for that matter, have contributed to the debacle, which is the collapse of the culture and destruction of the family. And now we got a bunch of millennials that don't believe in God anymore. This is where we're at. And I've been saying for a long time, the millennial generation is especially scary because not only do they come from a bunch of dysfunctional families because of the breakdown of the faith, but they are really the first generation without any sort of formal catechesis that they've been raised in the faith. They don't have that, right? Because as the apostasy hits parents, parents aren't sending their kids to formal training on catechesis, right? You know, and I could see it from my own Italian community. I mean, my parents were first generation. It was just a custom. That generation that came over in 1960s, you did all the traditional kind of ceremonies. You baptize your kids, you send them to catechism to get their first communion, and then their confirmation, and everything that comes along that forms the faith. These are all things the church gives us to help us maintain our faith and the graces that come from these sacraments, right? But my generation, really less than 20 years, 25 years, when they began to have children, they did not follow through on the traditions that came from the motherland. They decided to go at this religious liberty thing. Yeah, I believe in God, he's good, he's kind, but didn't follow through on the religious formation. Well, what do you expect now? You got a bunch of children that have been raised without any religious formation. Of course they're not going to believe in anything. Of course they're not. That's why we got 43% of millennials that now don't believe in anything. All right, and what does that mean for the future of the country? I mean, obviously voting, we already know, voting is just, it's going to be a disaster. You know, but even more so, what does it mean on human relations and how we treat each other? I mean, one of my colleagues on KOC reminded me the other day, has there ever been a pagan nation or a pagan empire that eventually doesn't force you to bow to their fake gods? Has there ever been one? That's why the future is dark. If 43% of millennials today have no belief in the existence of God, what's it going to be like in another 10 or 15 years? 50%, 55%, 60%? And how long before they demand or dictates that we worship whatever God it is they demand that we worship, right? Whatever false God, because that's how paganism works. At some point, we're all going to have to offer incense to pagan gods. It's always worked that way. And what happens when Christians, those on the political right who still claim to believe in true religion, what are they going to do then? Because they set up this environment. They set this whole thing up, this whole disaster, right? Granted, the far left satanic, but those are the children. Those are the offspring of the classical liberals. And we still don't want to acknowledge this fact in any kind of capacity. We just want to go, again, with our utilitarian principles. Let's just manipulate everybody through economic means. Everybody reacts to money, right? Well, that's not the case. It's not the case. Because money doesn't fix broken morality. It doesn't fix broken relationships. It doesn't fix our fallen nature. And this is where we're headed. We're a civilization that is headed straight for the cliff. And we're already probably in the middle of the dive, to be honest with you, right? I mean, when you see 43% of the new generation that doesn't believe in anything, good God, man, what's coming down the pipe? What kind of evil is coming down the pipe? What will they demand from us one day? What would they demand from our children who will live on long past my generation? How much will they have to surrender? How much will they have to sacrifice, right? I mean, for all the talk of an enlightened society since the Enlightenment, look at all the wars and the genocides that have happened. Forced belief of atheistic system, of those that never believed in true faith, forcing their will on those that actually believed in the one true God. The 18th, 19th, and 20th century are chock full of these atrocities. You think we're not setting up for this again? You think these pagan nations are not going to make us offer incense at some point, if not us, to our children? These are devastating numbers. And in many respects, it highlights the utter disaster classical liberal civilization has become. And I don't want to hear any talk about fascism, which is the deflection point that the classical liberal right-wingers are now making all over the place, including talk radio, because their ideas are collapsing. They need a boogeyman. They need a boogeyman. So they're never held responsible for these horrible, disastrous ideas that they have maintained and they've preached now for a long time, starting with talk radio. All right? When you begin to see talk radio hosts come out and say, okay, listen, I've been on the air for 30 years, and I've been telling you for 30 years communism was the problem, and thanks for making me nice and wealthy, by the way. But I just realized after 30 years, this is not communism. This is fascism. You got to change now? Now you figured it out? And if you've been wrong for 30 years on why or what has been hitting America and really all of the West, if you've been wrong on that for the past 30 years, why should I trust your judgment today? See, this is the right. In really, again, they're done. The political right is so lost at this point in history that now they have to concoct boogeymen in order to save their reputation. This is the problem, because we never want to deal with principles of truth. We wanted to deal with these abstract ideas of freedom and liberty, which mean anything to anybody, right? And now the chickens are coming home to roost. That's why I tell you guys, I don't trust the left. I think they're absolutely demonic. I don't trust the right. They're lost. They're gone, and they created most of these problems. 43% of millennials don't believe in God. Good God, man. Good God. What a disaster this civilization has become. What a disaster America is becoming at this point in history. I don't know. I don't know how we survive this. I'll be honest with you. But when I got good news, I'll bring it to you guys, okay? This is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.